Well, Suzanne, good afternoon.
Well, hello.
How are you doing this afternoon?
Just fine, just
Great.
fine.
I love your necklace. Tell me about it.
Thank you. A friend of mine got it from a friend of hers, and it's in two pieces, and one with two strands and one with the third. That she, I guess she usually makes it with two, and I'd wanted three, so here it is. And the woman who made it is Paiute, and they're made with number 9 beads.
Uh-huh.
So,
Do they have any larger representation or meaning?
no,
Okay, they're just beautiful. Yes.
just beautiful color and design
Yes,
work.
that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well,
What an eye. What an eye.
yeah. This is our second conversation. I greatly enjoyed the first one, and you were a little more critical of it than you needed to be. I think we'll have wonderful material from it, but there were a few things that we didn't cover, so that's what we'll do today. Um,
Okay.
and the one that you were most eager to talk about was the second of the plays that you wrote, Reclaiming One Star. And as I understand it, that has a lot of characters in it that are of interest to me for my book on Jim Thorpe, including Richard Henry Pratt and Pop Warner, and of course, mostly Lone Star Dietz. Um,
Right.
so let's take it in stages, but tell me first of all how you came upon the idea of writing this play.
I came into possession of a lengthy FBI report that had been done of an investigation of William Henry Dietz.
Yes.
And it was impossible to get from the FBI, but another friend of mine figured out how to do it through a vendor who had transcripts of court documents and investigations from that period, and got it, and then we put it on the National Museum of the American Indian website,
Wonderful.
and without any fanfare or anything, and you sort of have to know what you were looking for. And it has, it's the investigation they did of him.
And this was the
And
investigation they did during World War One. Is that correct?
yes, he had uh, failed to appear to be drafted, saying that he was a non-citizen Indian. So he didn't have to be drafted. And of course, that was at a time when all sorts of non citizen Indian people were um, volunteering and going to World War One in higher numbers, proportionately to the total population than any other group or segment of American society. So they did a full investigation of him because of his claim to be Indian.
And to repeat,
Uh,
so the listeners know who he was. He was, I mean, in terms of why he's of interest to us at Thorpe, he was a student and an assistant art director at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. He played on the football team, and he became a football coach after that in many different universities. Um, and of course, the play reveals, and as of other documents and the FBI documents reveal, that he was not Native American.
that both parents were German. The team propaganda, the Pro Football Inc. propaganda was and is that he was a beloved coach of the team, and that he, of the Washington football team, and that he is a full-blooded Sioux from South Dakota. So he was not. He was full-blooded German, German American from Wisconsin, and was apparently brought into to Carlisle by Pop Warner, the coach. And the way he was brought in had to have been done with complicity by Pratt and Warner. It had to have been done at the highest levels, and because they reached back into the files of a student from South Dakota who was from the Red Shirt Band of Oglala Lakota people, and his name was James One Star. And there are two prominent families of One Stars on Pine Ridge, the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota, and the Chiconju, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and they're both related, but they live on adjoining reservations. Right. So he had a very studious person. There's a photo of him that exists. He's not at all like Lone Star Dietz, who was a beefy kind of guy, and there's a very slight, tall, thin young man who left Carlisle, but not as a student. He left Carlisle as a member of the Army, of the U.S. Army, and went to the South, to the southern United States for orientation, I guess, in surveillance and how to evade the enemy in wartime. And he was assigned to a covert war, to be a soldier in a covert war, which was the U.S.'s participation on the side of Cuba in Cuba's War of Independence against Spain. And so he died in Cuba.
This is One Star you're talking about.
One Star died in Cuba. And his family was not told that he was in the Army, was not told that he died. They were not told anything. All of this information was kept from them. And then 20 years later, or so,
right.
15 years later, this German-American man that Pop Warner wanted on the football team showed up, and he was with the name Lone Star and the credentials of James One Star. And he began writing to, and he played football.
Yes.
And this is a real con artist and a user. He, there was a woman who was older than he was and unmarried, and an art teacher, a native woman, Angel Decora,
right.
Ho-Chunk, Winnebago. And she fell in love with him. And he married her, and in secret. So they were married while he was a student. And then he was, then others on the football team got busted. and for being ringers, that Pop Warner had brought them in, and they were either non-native or way adults, adults in their 30s, or both. And so that was a big public scandal, but Lone Star Dietz was not a part of that. He was affected by it in that very hastily his status was changed from student to assistant coach to Pop Warner and assistant art teacher to Angel Decora, his secret wife. So he, as a faculty member, he was not caught up in the student scandal of non-Indians. And he began writing to the sister of James One Star, to Sally Eagleheart, as her brother. So he was given their correspondence, and he picked it up as if not much time had elapsed, and he wrote to her as her brother, and did that for some time. And part of it was trying to get his annuity money, his lease money, and part of it was trying to get his land allotment. And of course, he knew no one would show up and let his sister, James One Star was dead, which his sister didn't know. But Lone Star Dietz knew it. And so he wasn't afraid that he would be exposed. But, and he wasn't until there was the actual trial of his draft evasion, and the prosecution. The U.S. federal entities brought in Sally Eagleheart, the sister of James One Star, and she said, "Why are you writing to me? You're not my brother."
And at the time, he was the coach of Washington State University. Is that right?
He was at Pullman, right?
Yes. He
was that, and Pop Warner continued, even though Pop Warner was fired in the middle of all of that, because of the scandals and him and his role in them.
He was pushed out. He wasn't quite fired. He went to Pittsburgh, but yes. Yeah.
Yes, right. You're right. And so was Pratt, pushed out.
Yes.
He chose to retire, and rather suddenly, and Pop Warner had chosen his way out rather suddenly. So,
well, Suzanne, there are so many interesting aspects to that story. One, of course, is how it reveals the venality of Pop Warner, along with this charlatan Lone Star Dietz. But what I'm curious about from you is, why would someone do this? What was the motivation for this charlatan to pretend that he was an Indian?
Well, we see it over and over again.
Yeah.
People attempting to pass as Native people when in fact they are not. In the 1930s, there was an act, the precursor to the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which makes it a crime to promote yourself as a Native artist, as an artist who makes a product that's supposedly Native made, when it's not, and also punishes the promoters of that person, of the fraud. But the precursor to that was an act called the Pseudo-Indian Act, and it was very just an elegant, spare act which criminalized impersonations of Indians, and that was that. It made felony offense of out of impersonating an American Indian.
And it was motivated by the fact that many people were impersonating Indians?
Yes.
And why were they doing
And,
it?
and why were they doing
Yeah.
it? Um, well, it's always for money.
Okay. Yeah.
It was always for
What is the
profit.
answer? Yeah.
So they were doing it to try to get land. They were doing it to try to get a job.
Uh-huh.
They were doing it to get on the lecture series. They were doing it to get into school. Same reasons they do it today. And it's a very common practice. Um, it, it Someone has once talked to me about it being the kind of thing that you see with military, with impersonators of military heroes,
Sure.
that they wear medals they haven't earned. They talk about engagement in combat situations where they never were, and they make up an entire hero status for themselves. And there's something, and the person who was spinning this out for me really made sense to me, that it is that kind of thing that people
does make sense.
Find some sort of self-esteem raising jolt from people believing they are heroic or they're something they're not.
But what does that say about the perception that white people would have about what it means to be an Indian? Sort of the complexity of that. Sort of diminishing them on one hand and making them seem noble or heroic on the other.
Well, yeah, that's right. And except they invariably are well received by other non-natives.
Uh-huh.
And why? Because they're familiar. They are non-native.
Uh-huh.
And they, so even if they adopt a persona of the savage Indian, they are well received. And they're especially well received if they adopt the persona of the noble savage. Sort of ironized Cody, shedding a tear for an environmental ad about cleaning up America. Don't throw trash. And he's Italian on both sides, Italian American, and never was native, but lived almost his whole life in the public eye, fooling lots and lots of people, thinking he was native. And this goes on. There are lots and lots of these frauds.
Yes, well, Lodestar Dietz was one. Another person close to Jim Thorpe was Sylvester Long, who portrayed himself as Chief Long Lance and claimed he was from various different tribes, as he made up his story.
I think actually he was native. On one side of his family, they were black, and on the other side they were Lumbee native. But the Lumbees were, as many are today, not held in high self-esteem, or not in high esteem by other natives, by many, who for a racist reason, because they're mixed with black.
Interesting.
And because they're not federally recognized, and they're there are about 40,000 Lumbee Indians. They were the people who ran the KKK out of Robeson County, North Carolina, in the 50s. And I would think that they would be given hero status wherever they go. But the Cherokee, Eastern Band of Cherokees has worked very hard to cultivate the white senators in North Carolina to support them and to oppose any sort of recognition for the Lumbees. That was not so much a situation back then for this Lance fellow.
Well, he claimed he was Cherokee, not Lumbee.
He claimed several
Yes.
Blackfoot,
Right. Yes.
Blackfoot,
Yep.
all sorts of things.
Yes.
But so as it turns out, I mean,
Anyway,
I just felt I had to say that because
that's important. Yes.
he actually, but it's sort of the same thing. What motivated him to choose other tribes? Well, because they were acceptable, and he was trying to, I guess, get away from being Lumbee and of being black on the other side. So, it goes right back to white racism. You have Forrest Carter, who did the education of Little Tree, who was actually a KKK member, who wrote the speech for George Wallace, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
My goodness.
And he wrote The Outlaw Josie Wales, a lot of things that people think are so authentically Native and were written by a Native person, and in fact they're not.
Yeah.
So this was, Lone Star Dietz was not original about anything. He was not authentic and not original, and Pop Warner wasn't either. They just picked people who would fit a certain body type and slot that was needed at school, and didn't care who they exploited in the doing of that.
Well, Pop Warner is pretty much the villain of my biography of Jim Thorpe in many ways. They had a complicated relationship, but Warner turned against him at Jim's moment of greatest peril and lied about it. I'm curious about your perspective after looking at Lone Star and other things. What you thought of Pop Warner and his role at Carlisle?
Oh, I totally agree. I'm glad you're exposing him as a villain, because he's been such a hero to so many people. I mean, look at all of these little kids who are in Pop Warner, the Pop Warner League, and my goodness, it's sort of like having a child abuser there with that kids are trying to use as a role model, and it's being forced on them, and that's so such an ugly thing that's still happening. I hope that at some point his name is taken off all the little kid stuff, because he was a bad man.
Yes.
He was a bad man.
I imagine, Suzanne, that you've been following the congressional hearings about your friend Dan Snyder, or non-friend Dan Snyder. Have you? Do you think that anything will finally come of that?
Well, I mean, my secret wish is that enterprising reporters and editors are going to come across a cache of emails that have nothing to do with sexual harassment or the women in the front office, but have to do with me and Amanda Blackhorse and Jillian Papan and Courtney Zotai, and others who were part of the 25 years of litigation against Pro Football Inc., and who were especially vilified by the Pro Football Inc. enterprise and all the business associates of.
Have you heard anything about that possibility of I mean, I'm sure those emails exist.
I'm sure they exist, and I'm really looking forward to the first call I get about them. So, and I'm not at all surprised
Uh-huh.
that, because it's the same thing. I mean, sexual abuse is and assault is about power. It's not about sex. And what happened to us was um, well, you have to sort of roll in money to do with power. That it's, money slash power,
Yes.
power slash money, and that's the same sort of tactic that was used against the women who litigated against racism of Pro Football Inc. Against their racism against Native peoples, and we were bullied in that same way that people are bullied in an office situation or out of an office situation by people who think they can just take liberties with women or with anyone they perceive as vulnerable.
What were
Particularly,
the elements of their bullying?
well, besides having people go through our garbage
Oh,
and
no
that sort
kidding.
of thing,
Yeah.
they um, there were people who stalked us,
Oh,
who um, not to this moment, but to this year, continue to make death threats
oh,
to us. Now, whether or not all of them are on the payroll
uh-huh.
of Pro Football Inc., I don't know. Some of them are, but most of them do this stuff anonymously,
Sure.
and they have paid fans who I have talked to who um, wear these ridiculous outfits and are paid for their whooping it up like idiots and pretending to be natives.
Right.
Uh, they also have paid thugs, and one of the people that we did know who it was, but who did not work for uh, Pro Football Inc., used to call and say things like, and we had tape. I mean, it was a tape machine, an
Yeah.
answering
Yeah.
machine, and and faxes. Fortunately, it wasn't emails, but we had faxes and tapes, and did take him to court and won a restraining order for 3 years, and so that was good. And by the end of the second year, he had, I guess, moved on to someone else and found another uh, person to focus his hostile fixation on. But one of his calls was pretty chilling. He said, "Take a good look in the mirror because that." Oh, I talked to the team this morning, and just take a good look in the mirror because that's the last time you're ever going to look the same.
Oh,
Now that to me is, I mean, besides that being emotional violence,
sure.
and it is even worse than someone saying, "I'm going to kill you, I'm going to do this or that," because it requires some sort of thought. Anyway, I was totally convinced that he had something to do with the football team, and no one has disputed that. I actually made that a part of our court record in the Black Horse case, where I was an expert witness, and in my deposition for the Pro Football Inc. attorneys, I made the our pursuit of this particular person and saying such things part of the court record, and suggested that Pro Football Inc. would be in a better position than I was to determine what the financial relationship might have been between the two. and I never heard anything about that.
No.
And
Of course not.
and there was no denial. There was no rebuttal at all. It was just silence. So
When you
we
were
shall see.
when you were threatened, did you ever go to authorities to report it?
I did not. Oh no, yes, I went to a judge.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and fortunately, I had a really good stalking lawyer, Suzanne Jackson, who actually was recommended to me by by Jamie Raskin.
Oh, no kidding. Well, you don't get better than Jamie in terms of constitutional law.
And she had run one of the clinics
Uh-huh.
at AU Law while he was working there. And so he was saying that she would be really good since she had helped write a lot of the stalking laws.
Yeah.
And she was great. And she won that restraining order against him. And we fortunately drew a woman judge who didn't question. She had piles of faxes and recordings, so she didn't. She was not skeptical. She was judgely and got right to the point of all of it. And
Great.
And that was terrific. So, and it worked. But what Counselor Jackson told me was not to be glib or cavalier about bullies and people who are stalking you, because you just don't know when their threatening words will turn into threatening actions. And that's really at the heart of what we were pursuing Pro Football Inc. about, was the way that the attitudes against Native people, the racism exhibited by their actions against Native people, the dehumanizing and objectification of us, the way that translated into actions against our people.
Boy, doesn't that translate into the larger world of today? So many ways, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, more later we'll see about how we might have been referred to, or
yes.
I know how we were referred to on the record. We don't need any proof of their disliking us. So,
well, Suzanne, your long fight on that whole issue of mascots and names and the diminishment of Native peoples in symbolic and real ways is one of the many fights that you've done. But I'm just so proud to interview someone who was awarded a Presidential Medal of Freedom. And tell me about that whole experience, how you were nominated, how you learned about it, what it was like to meet the president and be given that medal.
Well, I had met the president because I worked on the campaign in 2007 and 2008. And I had only worked for one president, and that was Jimmy Carter. When people were saying Jimmy who, and I just knew that he was going to be president, and I jumped on his campaign and was happy to campaign for him and work in transition and to be a political appointee in the Carter-Mondale thing. And I've never worked for another president, but I had that same feeling about candidate Obama, Senator Obama, when he first decided to run, that he was going to make it. And I had friends.
You're better than most political prognosticators.
Well, just twice.
I'm going to you next time, but I want to know who.
Yeah. And I had friends who were running, and I liked them, and I thought they were wonderful, and So I surprised myself by being an Obama person, but yet I was, and was so glad about that. The the Presidential Medal of Freedom, it the presidents who the presidents have all said, all the ones since Johnson. Johnson awarded the first ones from the list chosen by President Kennedy.
Uh-huh.
And that was the start of the Presidential Medals of Freedom. And what the presidents since Johnson have said, or including Johnson, is that it's the only thing they get to do, that they get to choose. So what happens at the staff level is there's a committee put together, a staff committee, and they take ideas from people all over the White House staff and, elsewhere. And they have so many slots each year to award people who are deserving and didn't get it while they were alive.
Uh-huh.
And so, like John McCain was awarded this time by President Biden, and I was surprised that he had never gotten that award before, and glad that finally he did. So they put together, the staff people put together elaborate lists of if you don't choose this one, then we need to move this one over, and that, so that they have the appropriate number of people who represent their values and their administration and all their political appointees and friends and family and the like. So, and for some, when President Trump awarded Rush Limbaugh, it was just one guy he gave the award to, and that was his friend, and that was it for that year. And but all the other presidents have given it to anywhere between a dozen and 20 people each year. So it's you're in a class,
Uh-huh.
and my class was 2014. With just some stunning people, and that I couldn't believe had never gotten it before, and myself, and I couldn't believe that. So I've been a big fan of the Medal of Freedom, as you can tell, for years and years and years, and never thought I would get that. I never envisioned myself as having it. And in fact, that year, I got calls from several friends in the White House asking who I thought should get it, and I gave them two different names, one person who was living and one person who was not, both native, who I thought they should have gotten it, and one has since got it the year after I did. And so that was my participation. I thought, oh, this is great. that maybe one of my people will get this great medal. So then I got a call from my friend Jody Archambault, who was the top-ranking woman in the Obama administration, a senior advisor on the domestic policy staff to the president, and had been one of the very first people hired for the White House staff for public engagement when she first started. And she was there for almost all the 8 years. Anyway, she called, and another person who had been, Raina Thiel, who had been in OMB, and then she was on the president's staff for public engagement. And so they called and told me that I was going to get this medal. And I didn't think I heard right. Because I was expecting them to say, and it's going to be our good friend,
Right.
Billy Frank was the one I thought would be getting it, and he's the one who did get it the next year. And so I just cried. I mean, there was nothing I could say to them, and they were just trying to keep me from crying, trying to tell me some nice things about it, and how many people you're allowed to have in your entourage, and what kind of thing it is, and what goes on, and that you can't tell anyone. It's all a big secret, and but of course you have to. Since you get to have an entourage, you have to tell the people you're inviting. And so everyone I called, I said, and be sure anyone you tell this to, tell them it's a big secret. So my son ended up telling his wife, who told her mother and father, who told her brother, and pretty soon someone called. A person farther out in the family called my son's partner, Sarah, and said, I guess you've already heard. At a time that they still thought it was a secret.
Right.
Anyway, and I'm sure this is going on, with everyone who gets that call. And it was a lovely event. I mean, everything about it was lovely. I had, there's a lithograph of a meeting that a treaty, it turned out to be a treaty, the making of an unwritten treaty between President Lincoln and heads of the Southern Plains Native nations, including one of my ancestors named Starving Bear or Lean Bear. A Cheyenne chief, and there were 3 people in the Cheyenne delegation, and 2 of them were related to us, and he was one, and he was not only the head of the Cheyenne delegation, but the head of he and 10 Bears from the Comanche Nation were the co-heads of the entire Southern Plains delegation, all the chiefs, and they were the only 2 who spoke. Actually, it turned out that my ancestor was the only one who spoke.
And they were in Washington meeting with President Lincoln?
Yes, in the East Room. And the lithograph, which is a French lithograph, shows that where he... in our family, we have vertigo, and he explained that there was something that would cause him to sit while he apologized to be sitting rather than standing. And where he was sitting was right where I was sitting in the East Room for that medal presentation. Now, what made that really poignant is for me, well, it also is the very place where President Lincoln was laid out when he laid in state. That was in the East Room, as well as President Kennedy, which all of this was hitting me because one person away from me, and we were all together in the recipients' receptions and our waiting rooms, and it's an all-day affair, was Ethel Kennedy. And so she was there for, I'm sure that this resonated with her as well, where she had been. With my own ancestor, when he left the so the treaty was very simple, that the Southern Plains nations would get new treaties that were away from, with territory that was away from the gold rushers and the people who were swarming their countries and making them sick, bringing all these diseases. So that was the native side, and the U.S. side was that Lincoln wanted a promise of their neutrality, the Southern Plains nations' neutrality in the Civil War, and so he got that, and the native peoples got the new treaties, not for a couple of years, but and after Lincoln died, but did get that. So within 2 years of that meeting, that unwritten treaty in 1863, Lean Bear, Starving Bear, was approached in Kansas territory when just he and one other person were out kind of scouting areas, where animal herds might be and that sort of thing. And they were approached by the Colorado Volunteers, who were out of their jurisdiction, and they were, while he was showing them his Lincoln Peace Medal, he wore it, and while he was showing them his letter of safe transit signed by the president, they murdered him.
Oh.
And then just in the same year, in the following year, those same Colorado Volunteers are the ones who carried out the massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek and in Colorado territory, and they massacred and murdered, mutilated the other two people who were in the Cheyenne delegation at that treaty meeting, Warbonnet and Stanzenwater.
Oh, that story tells the world, doesn't it?
And so just within 2 years of that meeting, the entire Cheyenne delegation and the president were killed by white supremacists, which was fascinating to me always. So all of that was, there I was seated in where my ancestor had been and about to get a medal, which, if you want to show progress, that would be progress, because I didn't get killed for it after I left. And happily, President Obama is still alive. And there were no repercussions of a negative kind that came with that medal. So, I was super happy. One of the sons of one of my first friends in New York City when I moved there was Carolyn Goodman, who later became the chair of the radio station where I worked, WBAI, and she had been with the other mothers of the 3 young men who were voting rights heroes at Mississippi.
Jenny Schwarter and Goodman, that's the Goodman. Huh?
Absolutely, they had organized themselves into a very powerful force, and I did not know her there then. I knew her after that had happened, and after they had brought a spotlight to that. That's when she started inviting me to her salons. which the Upper West Side get-togethers, and introduced me to a lot of people I never would have met otherwise. So Carolyn Goodman was just a really important person in my life, and there were all these connections in among that class of people. Some there was no connection of that kind, but with many there were, and so it was. It was a fabulous experience for me.
So much,
I didn't have
so
to
much
do
history
anything.
in that story. So much history, you know, American history at its worst and its best in some ways.
Yeah. Well, here's um, John Dingle, Representative Dingle, who was retired,
Yeah.
Was next to me, and the two of us there were three of us in that class who um, weren't good walkers,
Uh-huh.
and so we were all supposed to stay seated, but then Stevie Wonder, yay,
What a
um,
class! Wow.
decided to stand up,
Uh-huh.
and that was on the other side of the room. And he let everyone know that he'd like to stand during when he was receiving it, and but that was during rehearsal, so that was good.
Yeah.
John Dingle and I were supposed to stay seated, and it's a very narrow staging area, and fortunately, President Barack Obama was very agile,
Yes.
and John Dingle um, was we'd been in a holding room, and uh, Vice President Biden came in and was greeting us all, and John Dingle was had gone from a massive figure and force to a very narrow shadow of himself, and I didn't recognize him when I first saw him, and I had known him for a long time. Well, that happened with Joe Biden. He greeted us all very warmly and moved on into the hallway to wait to be called into the room, and where the ceremony was going to be held. And John Dingle said to me, he didn't recognize
Wow.
me.
Yeah.
He didn't know who I was, and I could see past John, and there was Joe Biden in the hallway, and he just threw up his hands. It hit him. He realized what he had done, and he came back and he said, "Big John," and they greeted each other very warmly and started reminiscing, and I mean, he had known John Dingle since he first was elected to the Senate, so a very long time. Anyway, it was a wonderful thing, and then they called his name, and so he went out, and pretty soon we're on stage, and John said, "I'm going to stand up." I said, "Oh." And I think it's because people weren't recognizing him, and he just wanted to show that he was strong enough to stand. And I said, "Are you sure?" And he said yes. And there had been a very elaborate choreography worked out during rehearsal, and the president was supposed to go behind each of us and give us our medals. And so as the president was approaching Representative Dingle, his eyes got really big, and I realized that John was standing up slowly but steadily, and pretty soon he was standing, and Obama kind of halted and readjusted his thinking. His eyes were very big, and he said, he didn't have to say anything. There was the military reader
Right.
who was giving that part of the ceremony, and so he just had to do the metal fixing, and then he moved to. So that was over.
Yep.
John sat down, and President moved behind me, and I said, "Don't worry about me. I'm just going to sit here." And he said, "Well, I'm glad someone around here is doing something I tell them to."
Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe, is available online and at bookstores on August 9th. Visit davidmarinus.com to order your copy. This has been an episode of the David Marinus Ink in Our Blood podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll subscribe to the Ink in Our Blood podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or whichever podcast service you prefer. If you loved it, we'd love it if you left a rating and review. Ink in Our Blood is produced by Metamorphosis.agency. Music has been written and provided by Monica Ryan. Ink in Our Blood is hosted by Sarah Marinus Vanderschaff. Thank you for listening.